In general, you want your LDL to be low as possible and your HDL to be on the high side. But how high? An important new study suggests there's a limit to how high you want your HDL to be. The good guy may turn into the bad one. One of the authors is Arshad Quyyumi, who is Professor of Cardiology at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia.
Thank you.
This has been a bit of a mystery in a sense, that when you look at populations as a whole, your high-density lipoproteins be called the good form of cholesterol because it's supposed to remove cholesterol from the blood vessels, and yet whenever they develop a new HDL treatment, people seem to get worse.
Exactly. There has been this paradox that agents that are associated with increasing HDL levels have never been associated with improvement in mortality in the same proportion as you would expect. So this paradox has always been a bit puzzling, and it becomes clearer now that we have some more data looking at very high HDL levels and what the impact of that has been.
So in this study, you looked at a very large number of people who have naturally high HDL levels.
We are looking at people who have evidence of cardiovascular disease already. So this is somewhat of a high-risk population. And we have looked at this in two separate populations. And in both of these cohorts, we have been able to examine the impact of HDL levels on long-term outcomes.
And what did you find?
One was the expected finding, which is that very low HDL levels were associated with increased mortality risk. But what was somewhat unexpected was that at very high levels, it was also associated with increased risk of cardiovascular events. And when I say very high levels, we looked at above 80 milligrams per deciliter.
And in Australian terms, that's over 2 millimoles per litre, when in fact the recommendation in Australia is having it around about 1 or just a little bit over 1. Did you compare it to LDL?
What we did was to adjust for LDL levels so that we didn't let that LDL level interfere with the interpretation of what was happening at different HDL levels.
Why is this happening?
So one thing that we cannot completely ignore is that this population also has high alcohol intake on average. And some of the increased HDL level might be accounted for this. There are other studies that have speculated that non-cardiovascular diseases such as infection rates, some autoimmune conditions, etc., may be more common in this population.
Any difference between men and women?
Yeah, there were some differences in men and women. And this is important to understand, I think, both for the high-risk population, the one that we are talking about, the coronary disease, but we have another study where we looked at people without coronary disease, the general population, which shows that there is a difference between men and women in terms of the proportion who would have very high levels of HDL. So proportionately more women have high HDL levels or very high HDL levels than men. The high risk in men seems to appear around the level of 80 and above. In women, it probably appears at a little higher level.
Are there any therapeutic interventions which will reduce HDL?
That's a good question.
I suppose you can start smoking and stop taking exercise, but that's not going to help you.
Reducing alcohol intake is probably the only thing.
There's an epidemiological concept called attributable fraction. Again, sorry for the jargon, but it's that of all people who die of a heart attack or of all people who get a heart attack, how much can you attribute to a very high HDL? Have you worked that out?
That's a good question. The best way to think about it is that it's not just a little thing. It's about 2% of the coronary disease population. But in the general population, 2% of men have HDL above 80. That's millions and millions of people. And almost 10 to 12% of women have levels that high. It's also worth knowing that we often used to say to women, oh, your HDL is 90, you're protected. And actually, that level is not protective.
I mean, the other troubling thing about this, Arshad, is that people are encouraged to go to the general practitioner and have something called an absolute risk score. In other words, you don't just get treated for your blood pressure if your blood pressure is a little bit up. It's what your total chances are of having a heart attack or a stroke in the next 5 or 10 years. And most risk equations have HDL. I mean, does this undermine the risk equations?
Perhaps we should revisit those equations. I think they're generally correct because the low side is where they are acting, right? If you have low HDL levels, it gives you a higher risk and so on. But at the high end, they are not taking into account the fact that if you have an HDL of 90 or whatever, you don't get a higher mark. You treat it as if you have normal HDL levels. If doing that would tweak the equations a little bit, and it'll help this extraordinarily high risk cohort of maybe 2 to 5% of men and women who fall into that category, and give them an adequate risk measure, which may be misinterpreted at this point because there has been no recognition.
Arshad, thank you very much for joining us.
Oh, you're welcome.
Arshad Quyyumi is Professor of Cardiology at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia.
ABCRN helps you understand the world. Find more of our stories on the ABC Listen app.